The transport ship lurched through gray Atlantic waves in the summer of 1943, carrying its human cargo westward. Below deck, hundreds of German prisoners of war sat in dim holds, their stomachs hollow from weeks of short rations. They had been captured in North Africa, plucked from the desert sand after Rommel's Afrika Korps collapsed under Allied pressure. Now they were sailing toward America, the land they had been taught to despise. Among them sat Feldwebel Karl Hoffman, a veteran of 3 years of desert warfare. His ribs pressed against his uniform, his cheeks sunken from months of dwindling supplies. He remembered the final weeks in Tunisia, when their rations had been cut to a handful of stale crackers and weak tea. His unit had fought not just the British and Americans, but hunger itself. "What do you think they'll do to us?" whispered the young soldier beside him, barely 19, his eyes wide with fear. Hoffman said nothing. He had heard the stories. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as brutal savages who would starve their prisoners, work them to death, or worse. But he had also seen something else in the desert. The endless streams of American supplies, the trucks that never stopped coming, the rations the Allied soldiers ate that seemed impossibly abundant. When the ship docked at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the prisoners were marched down the gangway under armed guard. The first thing Hoffman noticed was the smell, not the stench of decay or deprivation he expected, but something else entirely. Food, cooking meat, fresh bread. The aroma drifted from somewhere beyond the port, rich and overwhelming. They were loaded onto trains, not cattle cars, but actual passenger coaches with cushioned seats. Through the windows, as the train rolled westward toward the camps of Texas and Oklahoma, the prisoners pressed their faces against the glass. Electric lights blazed in every farmhouse. Towns sparkled with illumination even at night. Fields stretched endlessly, heavy with crops. It contradicted everything they had been told about America's supposed weakness. 3 days later, Hoffman stood in line at Camp Hearn in Texas, clutching a metal tray. The mess hall was unlike anything he had imagined. Steam rose from behind long counters. The smell of cooking food was so intense it made his head swim. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in months. The American cook, sleeves rolled up, barely glanced at him as he dropped food onto the tray. A hamburger patty on a soft white bun, a pile of fried potatoes, green beans glistening with butter, a slice of pie, and a small carton of milk. Hoffman stared at the tray as if it were an illusion. His hands trembled. Behind him, other prisoners shuffled forward, equally stunned. Some whispered in disbelief. Others stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. "Move along," the cook said flatly, already serving the next man. Hoffman carried his tray to a wooden table and sat. Around him, prisoners ate in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. The hamburger was hot, juicy, rich with fat. The potatoes were crisp and salty. The milk was cold and sweet. It was more food than he had seen in 6 months of combat. But what happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. After the meal, as prisoners filed out of the mess hall, Hoffman paused near the kitchen entrance. Through the doorway, he could see American soldiers scraping their plates into large metal bins. His breath caught in his throat. They were throwing food away. Not spoiled food, not rotten scraps. Perfectly good food, half-eaten hamburgers, untouched portions of vegetables, slices of bread, with just one bite taken. The soldiers scraped it all into the garbage with casual indifference, laughing and talking as they worked. Hoffman stood transfixed. He watched as one American guard tossed an entire uneaten apple into the bin. Another dumped half a plate of mashed potatoes. A third threw away 3 whole dinner rolls. A younger prisoner came up beside him, following his gaze. "Mein Gott," the boy whispered. They're wasting it." "Ja," Hoffman said quietly. His throat felt tight. They had not seen this level of abundance in Germany for years. Even before the war, food had been carefully rationed, every crumb precious. His own family back in Hamburg survived on black bread and thin soup. His mother saved potato peels to make broth. His sister boiled grass to stretch their meals. And here, the Americans were throwing away enough food to feed his entire village for a week. As weeks passed, the ritual repeated itself with mechanical regularity. 3 times a day, the prisoners lined up for meals that would have been feasts in Germany. Breakfast brought eggs, bacon, toast with real butter, coffee with cream and sugar. Lunch was sandwiches piled high with meat and cheese, soup, fruit. Dinner was the most overwhelming. Roasted chicken, beef stew, pork chops, always with multiple sides, always with dessert. And after every meal, the garbage bins filled with waste. Hoffman began to observe this ritual with the fascination of a scholar studying a foreign civilization. He watched the Americans dump entire portions of uneaten food. He saw them scrape plates that still held half their contents. He witnessed soldiers throw away food they simply didn't want to finish. One evening, he couldn't contain himself any longer. He approached one of the guards, a young sergeant from Iowa, and asked in halting English, "Why? Why do you throw away the food?" The sergeant looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "The food. Good food. You throw it away every day." The sergeant shrugged. "Oh, that. Yeah, regulations say we got to prepare 10% more than needed to make sure everyone gets full rations. The extra gets tossed. Can't save it. Health regulations and all." Hoffman stared at him. "You make extra on purpose?" "Sure. Better too much than too little, right?" The sergeant walked away, already forgetting the conversation, but Hoffman could not forget. He stood there in the Texas heat, watching the kitchen crew dump another bin of perfectly edible food, and felt something crack inside him. This was not cruelty. This was not deprivation. This was abundance so vast that waste was built into the system. In his bunk that night, Hoffman tried to write a letter to his mother. The censors would read it, he knew, but he had to try to explain what he was witnessing. "Dearest mother, I am well. The camp is not what we expected. We are fed 3 times daily with more food than I can finish. There is meat, vegetables, bread, even sweets. But mother, the most shocking thing, they throw away food here. Good food. Food that would feed you and Maria for days. They have so much that they waste it without thought. I do not understand this world." He paused, his pencil hovering over the paper. How could he make her understand? In Hamburg, she stood in line for hours for a single loaf of bread made partly from sawdust. Here, the Americans threw whole loaves into the garbage because they had grown slightly stale. The letter was returned to him weeks later, heavily censored. Most of his description of the food had been blacked out. The censors, it seemed, didn't want Germans back home to know about American abundance, but Hoffman's mother would never read it anyway. The bombing of Hamburg later that year would ensure that. One afternoon in the fall of 1943, Hoffman was assigned to work in the camp kitchen. It was considered good duty, warm in winter, and the workers often received extra rations. But for Hoffman, it became an education in American excess. The head cook, a heavy-set man from Louisiana named Pete, showed him how to peel potatoes. "You can leave a bit of skin on, don't worry about it," Pete said. "We got plenty." Hoffman nodded, but he peeled each potato with Germanic precision, removing only the thinnest layer of skin. His mother had taught him never to waste. Pete watched him for a while, then laughed. "Boy, you're taking too long. Here, like this." He grabbed a potato and peeled it quickly, great thick strips of flesh coming off with the skin. Half the potato seemed to vanish into the garbage bucket. Hoffman's hands froze. "But that is good potato. You are throwing away food." Pete shrugged. "We got sacks and sacks of them. Don't worry about it. Speed matters more than saving every bit." That night, Hoffman lay in his bunk, calculating. In the kitchen that day, they had peeled 200 pounds of potatoes. Pete's method had probably wasted 40 pounds of edible potato flesh. 40 pounds. In Germany, that would feed a dozen families for a week. Here, it went into the garbage without a second thought. Other prisoners reported similar experiences. Those who worked in the cannery watched as imperfect vegetables were discarded. Perfect corn, slightly misshapen, tomatoes with minor blemishes, all of it garbage. Those who worked in the bakery saw whole batches of bread thrown out because they were a day old. "They have too much," one prisoner whispered at night. "It's not possible. No nation can have this much." But the evidence was undeniable. America did not have too much. It had more than too much. It had so much that careful conservation was unnecessary. As months passed, the food waste became more than a curiosity. It became a philosophical crisis for the prisoners. Everything they had been taught about the world was being dismantled, one garbage bin at a time. Nazi propaganda had told them that America was on the verge of collapse, that the diverse population, The democratic chaos, the Jewish influence, all of it meant weakness and decay. Germany, they were told, was strong because it was unified, disciplined, racially pure. The fatherland would triumph because it was lean and efficient, while America was fat and lazy. But what Hoffman and his fellow prisoners were discovering was the opposite. America was strong precisely because it was abundant. It could afford to be wasteful because its production was so vast. It didn't need to carefully ration every crumb because it could simply make more. In the barracks at night, debates raged among the prisoners. Some, the die-hard Nazis, insisted this was all a trick, a temporary show to demoralize them. Wait until they need the food for themselves, these men argued. Then we will see their true nature. But most had seen too much to maintain that belief. They had watched American workers in the camp eating the same food, throwing away the same waste. They had seen the trucks arriving with supplies, endless trucks, never stopping. They had glimpsed the American towns nearby, with shops full of goods and civilians who looked well-fed and content. Hoffman found himself in conversations he never thought he would have. One night, an older prisoner named Werner, a former schoolteacher, spoke quietly. "We were taught that our suffering made us strong, that hardship built character. But what if abundance builds strength too? What if having enough means you can focus on other things, on innovation, on building, on living?" Another prisoner, a young corporal named Hans, shook his head. "It feels wrong, sinful, to have so much that you throw it away." "Yes," Werner agreed, "but perhaps that is our poverty talking, not our morality." The conversation fell into uncomfortable silence. These men had been raised in scarcity. Even before the war, even in Germany's better years, careful conservation had been a virtue. You finished every bite on your plate. You saved the bread crusts. You boiled bones for broth and used them again and again until they crumbled. To see food treated as something disposable was deeply disturbing. It violated everything they understood about the value of sustenance. Hoffman began keeping a mental ledger, comparing his life in the camp to his life in the Wehrmacht. The comparison was devastating. In the Afrika Korps, even at the war's start when things were going well, their rations had been modest. Black bread, canned meat of dubious quality, thin soup, weak coffee, perhaps some dried fruit. As the campaign wore on and supply lines stretched, rations dwindled. Toward the end, they were lucky to get hard biscuits and water. Here in the camp, breakfast alone exceeded their best field rations. Eggs, bacon, toast, jam, coffee with real cream. And if you wanted more, you could get seconds. The guards encouraged it. For lunch, thick sandwiches with actual slices of ham or beef. Soup that contained real meat, not just broth flavored with bone. Fresh vegetables, not canned or preserved. Fruit, apples or oranges, given out like they cost nothing. Dinner was a feast every single night. Roasted chicken with crispy skin, beef stew with chunks of meat as big as your fist, pork chops thick and juicy, and sides, always multiple sides, mashed potatoes with butter and gravy, green beans swimming in butter, corn on the cob, salad with actual lettuce, and dessert, cake or pie or pudding every single night. The prisoners gained weight. Their hollow cheeks filled out. Their ribs stopped showing. Their skin regained color. They looked healthier than they had in years. And the Americans threw away more food in a single day than the Wehrmacht had given them in a week. Christmas of 1943 brought the most profound shock of all. The prisoners expected nothing, perhaps a slightly better meal, but nothing special. Instead, American church groups and civilian organizations sent Christmas packages, hundreds of them. Each prisoner received a box containing cigarettes, candy, toiletries, games, and small luxuries. Local churches sent homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. Civilian women from the nearby town prepared a special Christmas dinner. The meal itself defied belief. Roasted turkey, glazed ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, stuffing, multiple vegetable dishes, rolls with butter, and an array of pies, apple, pumpkin, cherry. It was more food than most of the prisoners had seen in their entire lives. They ate until they were sick. Some actually vomited from overeating, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle the volume. Others wept openly, overwhelmed by the abundance. And then came the moment that broke Hoffman completely. After the meal, as the prisoners sat in stunned silence, the cleanup began. The American cooks and soldiers started clearing the tables, and as Hoffman watched, they scraped enormous quantities of food into the garbage bins. Whole portions of turkey barely touched, piles of mashed potatoes, entire slices of pie. One young American soldier, laughing with his companions, dumped half a turkey leg into the garbage. He hadn't even gnawed the meat off the bone. He just threw it away. Hoffman stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked out of the mess hall, past the guards, into the cold December air. He leaned against the barracks wall, his breath coming in short gasps. Behind him, one of the other prisoners, Werner the schoolteacher, came out. "Karl?" "They threw away a turkey leg," Hoffman said, his voice hollow. "A whole leg. My family hasn't seen meat like that in 5 years. My mother boils bones for soup. My sister saves potato peels. And they threw it away like it was nothing." Werner nodded slowly. "We lost the war, Karl. We just didn't know it yet. We lost it before it even started." "What do you mean? How do you fight a nation with so much abundance that it builds waste into its system? We were starving in the desert, counting every bullet, while they threw away food. Our factories were running on slave labor and desperation, while theirs ran on such plenty that they could be careless. We never had a chance." Hoffman slid down to sit on the cold ground. "Everything we were told was a lie." "Yes," Werner said simply. "Everything." As spring arrived in 1944, Hoffman had been a prisoner for nearly a year. In that time, his understanding of the world had been completely rebuilt. The food waste, which had initially shocked him, now seemed like a window into something larger. America's strength was not despite its abundance, but because of it. A nation that could afford to waste food was a nation with such deep reserves of power that it was essentially invulnerable. Germany had mobilized every resource, extracted every ounce of production from its people, and still could not match what America did almost casually. He began to understand other things too. The American guards, despite being victors, treated the prisoners with a certain casual respect. Not warmth exactly, but a lack of cruelty that was its own form of dignity. They enforced rules, but they didn't brutalize. They maintained order, but they didn't humiliate. This too was abundance. Hoffman realized the abundance of confidence. America didn't need to be cruel because it was so certain of its victory. It could afford to treat even its enemies with basic humanity. One day, working in the kitchen, Hoffman watched Pete the cook prepare a meal. Pete worked with efficiency, but also with a kind of joy. He sang as he cooked. He tasted the food and adjusted seasonings. He took pride in his work, even though he was just feeding prisoners. "Pete," Hoffman asked carefully, "why do you cook so well for us?" "We are the enemy." Pete looked at him, surprised. "Well, hell, you still gotta eat, don't you? Might as well be good food. Nobody deserves to eat slop, even prisoners." It was said so casually, so matter-of-factly, that Hoffman almost missed the profound philosophy embedded in it. In Pete's worldview, even enemies deserved good food. Basic human dignity was not something you earned through loyalty or victory. It was just something people deserved. By the time the war ended in May 1945, Hoffman and most of his fellow prisoners had undergone a complete transformation. They had arrived as soldiers of the Reich, believers in German superiority. They left as men who had seen behind the curtain and found all their beliefs wanting. The food waste had been the key that unlocked everything else. It had shown them that the world was not as they had been taught, that abundance could be strength, that democracy could be efficient, that diversity could create power rather than weakness. When the time came for repatriation, many prisoners felt torn. They wanted to see their families, to return home. But home was now a devastated landscape of rubble and starvation. They would be returning to a place where every crumb mattered, where waste was unthinkable, where suffering was the daily reality, and they would carry with them the memory of a place where the garbage bins overflowed with food. Hoffman wrote one final letter before leaving, addressed to no one in particular, just words for himself. "I have seen the future, and we are not in it. We built our strength on suffering and sacrifice, and we believed that made us superior. But I have seen a nation built on abundance, where even prisoners eat like kings, and waste is so common no one notices. They won, not because they were harder or more ruthless, but because they had so much they could afford to be careless. What kind of power is that? It is a power we never imagined. We lost not to warriors, but to farmers and factory workers who produced so much they didn't know what to do with it all. I will go home now to the ruins. I will try to rebuild, but I will never forget the sound of food being scraped into garbage bins. That sound is the sound of our defeat. Not the explosions, not the gunfire, but that quiet, endless sound of abundance being discarded. We were told we were the master race, but masters do not starve while their prisoners feast. Years later, long after the war, Karl Hoffman would tell his grandchildren about his time as a prisoner in America. He would describe many things: the Texas heat, the American guards, the endless work details. But always inevitably, he would come back to the food. You cannot understand, he would tell them, these children who had grown up in prosperous West Germany, what it meant to see food thrown away. For us, every piece of bread was precious. Every potato peel was saved. And then suddenly, we were in a place where they made extra food just to throw it away. It broke something in our minds. Was it cruel, Opa? His granddaughter once asked, to show you so much and then send you home to hunger? Hoffman considered this. No, Liebling, it was not cruel. It was honest. They showed us the truth, that we had been lied to about everything, about who was weak and who was strong, about what real power looked like. The cruelty would have been to let us continue believing the lies. He paused, his old eyes distant. The Americans defeated us with bombs and bullets, yes, but they really defeated us with garbage bins full of wasted food, because that showed us something we could never unsee, that they had so much they could afford not to care. And we, who prided ourselves on efficiency and strength, we had been starving all along. The memory of those garbage bins stayed with him until the end. In the prosperous Germany that rose from the ashes, where supermarkets overflowed with goods and restaurants disposed of uneaten meals, Hoffman never quite lost the habit of eating everything on his plate. He would scrape his dishes clean, even when full. He would save leftovers that others might throw away, because he had seen what abundance looked like, and he had learned that abundance was not just about having enough. It was about having so much that you could afford to waste it. That was the true measure of power, and that power had defeated his nation absolutely.